let's start at the beginning. And Louis really set the stage exceptionally well for us. The obvious question is why? Why should businesses care about the impact of climate change? Is this a distraction or is it core to their activities?
Well, I think the responsibility is to make it core for two reasons. I mean, there's an obvious one about responsibility to our planet and to our world, and you can't see whether you look at it in a purely analytic sense of the data of the rate of growth of carbon dioxide and related GHG gases in the atmosphere, or you look at it in an analog sense in stories like the story of the last couple of weeks with the fires and the smoke coming down. Whether you look at it from either angle, we can't help but see that we're in a moment of dramatic change. And I mean literally a split-second moment. If we were using slides, I'd show you 800,000 years of data of constant CO2 in the atmosphere and a vertical rise in the last couple hundred years that it's hard to believe when you actually see it laid out that way. So that's the responsibility side. But then you have the other side of this, which is this will be the biggest industrial transformation in generations that we've all experienced over the next 2 to 3 decades. And it will require, and hopefully it will receive, $3 to $5 trillion a year of investment across the entire global economy to transition us to a decarbonized planet. And I think as any business leader looking ahead, it makes so much more sense to align with where the tailwinds of investment are rather than face the headwinds and try to preserve the existing business model. So I actually think you asked it just the right way. There are people who say, well, it's the right thing to do, but we sort of treat it as a distraction because it's not really our business. And for them, one, it'll be hard to maintain focus. How often do we maintain focus on things that aren't core to our business over sustained periods of time? But second, you miss the opportunity, which is to really align this to the core of the business strategy and seek to turn this into competitive advantage, seek to turn this into growth, which I know is one of the themes of this conference. So from my end, it is a responsibility, yes, but it is also an enormous opportunity. And we have so many clients that are engaged in trying to find both of those logics to drive their agendas, to shape what they do, and how fast they act.
Well, you have long been an advocate personally of mission-driven companies. And so that first part of it, you're very comfortable with. But you're saying you're advising clients today that on the basis of their business planning,
absolutely,
that it makes good business sense, as Louis was saying, to focus on this particular area.
I think it's easy to miss how fast the groundwork underneath us is changing in terms of the expectations. Some of that comes from our employees, and we've been hearing that for years. I mean, many companies, if you have asked a couple years ago, would have started with how much, if they're going to attract a world-class workforce and bring new people in, how much it's an expectation of them that they will be joining a company that takes these kinds of issues, and I would say ESG more generally, in a very serious way, promoting environments that are responsible to the planet, that promote diversity and equity and inclusion, and that take those things on. So that's one element. But I think that the other elements around this are the way investors are changing, the way transparency is changing, the metrics that are coming out literally this month from the International Sustainability Standards Board. That's a global organization founded by the IFRS, the leading sort of standard-setting bodies. I think we're going to be subject to much more transparency in the years ahead. There are rules coming along in many countries. Canada's pushed pretty far. Europe is pushing very far in terms of transparency. I think that the expectations are changing. And so for many of our clients, they're trying to say, what do we need to do to come out of this not just surviving, but to come out thriving? And I think that's sometimes it's a very straightforward question. Recraft your products in a particular direction, appeal to a particular segment. Sometimes it's an exceptionally difficult question. You've got business models built over decades. How fast can you change them? How much capital? How will your customers see that? And so I'm not in any way trying to make this seem easy. I think it's exceptionally challenging, but I think more and more it's being seen as the core for many, many businesses of what's important.
You've made the argument this is an opportunity. There's going to be vast amounts of money being spent. Somebody is going to be receiving that money. And if you can get in front of that curve, there's an opportunity there for you. What about the downsides? what about what are the negative sides if companies don't act? For example, the responsibility, you've written about the role of chairs of boards of directors. And one of the key roles of any board of directors is risk management.
Absolutely.
Are companies increasingly in jeopardy and boards in jeopardy if they don't give attention to the impacts of climate change on their company and the impacts of their company on climate change?
I think that the challenge facing boards of directors now is so much higher than it was a decade ago. A decade ago, we were navigating a pretty tricky economic climate, but you could just focus on economics. Globalization was cranking along. These other factors, someone was talking about them in a theoretical sense. They were much less real. And I think over the last particularly last 5-7 years, we've seen such a rising bar of expectations from society. We've seen such a more complex world in geopolitics. We've seen the translation of the Paris Accords, which were signed in 2015, but more or less ignored for 3 years, over the last 5 years have taken on a greater and greater role. We see all the challenges around diversity, depending on where you are in the world, that presents itself in different ways. And now we've got this generative AI wave underway. And so I think to be a board member now, or a board chair, or a CEO, is to be thinking both about what are the opportunities to build advantage in the years ahead and take advantage of these trends, but also how do we think about where the risks are? How do we build strong scenarios? How do we get ahead of it so we're having the right conversations early and we're preparing ourselves for the kind of pressures we might see? And to think about what will winning be in 2030, not was winning in 2020. And that's obviously a very difficult discussion for anyone, and it doesn't have easy answers, but that is a big shift in responsibilities.
You wrote recently about the relationship between chairs and CEOs and saying that that's in evolution. How does this drive that change?
I think first of all, if you think about boards of years past, you'd pick board members often who had a lot of experience, were seen as sort of wise individuals to be around the table, to bring their wisdom, to help the CEO and help the management team solve the hardest problems. The challenge is this world is not one that those board members, now some boards have evolved their composition a bit to get a bit more diverse, to get different capabilities onto the board, but still, the center mass of most boards are people that really haven't lived in these worlds any more than the management team. But the management team's living it day in and day out. They're feeling those pressures. They're watching their competitors. I think that to be a board member today is to take on a much greater responsibility for learning, for engaging in a dialogue rather than espousing wisdom, for asking questions, not seeing yourself as there to provide answers. I think that is not a mindset shift for every board member, to be sure, but I think for many boards as a whole and for many individual members, it's a shift in mindset of why you're there and how you bring the most value to that. And then if you're the CEO, you need to have a dialogue with the chair or the lead director, depending on the construct, about, well, how do we help the board to be able to ask those right questions, help the board to be able to evaluate these trade-offs on plans that will be coming to them to make decisions on, and not assume just through the wisdom of years past of having been leading business executives or leading political leaders or NGO leaders, that they're necessarily going to have the experiences that will allow them to ask the right questions, to make the right judgment calls on whether to support plans that management's bringing forward. So that requires a kind of open two-way dialogue that, again, in great companies has often existed, but doesn't always exist when you talk to CEOs and boards about how they perceive those interactions.
But there's a fundamental change here. I think you're saying that increasingly, the most important factor or quality that a director can have is the ability to ask the right question as opposed to the ability to supply the answer.
Of all the quotes I've used a lot from non-BCG, I use some BCG stuff too, but of the non-BCG stuff, I think that the one I've used the most often is a Satya Nadella quote about when people have asked about this dramatic transformation in Microsoft under his leadership, and they ask him why. At least when I've heard him speak about that, his first response is we went from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. And that was the shift. And this was pre-OpenAI, pre all the stuff of the last 6 to 9 months. When I heard him say this was 2019, it was pre-COVID actually, in a speech when he joined BCG at one of our partner meetings. And And I think if you think about the role of a board, oftentimes the board was not necessarily the know-it-all culture about the company, but sort of the wisdom of the ages sort of around that table. And I think for boards too, it's a time when a learn-it-all mindset is going to be incredibly important for all of us to navigate this massive environmental change we're dealing with, the AI change, and all of the other pressures that we're feeling.
And how do you assess the progress that's been made by your clients at this point? Are they ahead of the curve, or are they still being pulled along behind it?
So let's focus on the climate and sustainability side of that. There are many different. I think in AI, everybody's in a very rapid learning mode. We can come back to that if you want. But if I focus on climate and sustainability, I would say relative to where they were 3 to 5 years ago, the vast majority of clients and companies, they're not always our clients, that I get to engage with or meet management teams or boards, have genuinely stepped up their the bar that they're moving toward, have often embraced the need to make progress, have put up targets. Many of the leading companies now have worked with the Science Based Targets Initiative to have their plans approved. That's been growing 65% increase every year in the number of companies with approved SBTI plans. It's almost 5,000 now. So I think that that's real progress. I would highlight, though, that there's some real shortfalls. I think that most companies still first and foremost think about what they do within their four walls, their own operations. If you're into the climate parlance, you would think about that as scope 1 and 2 rather than scope 3. But for most companies, their scope 3s, whether it's their upstream purchases of the materials in their products or the downstream impacts of their products, swamp their scope 1 and 2. I think, but it has less control. It's less clear how to measure it. It's less clear what to do about it. So I think many companies have avoided that, even though it's incredibly important. I think many of them have set targets that are for sure better than where they were. But when you look at what the planetary requirements are and what we need to do to make progress, perhaps not as bold. Many have not yet figured out as deeply how they engage with their customers to turn this into advantage. I mean, there's some wonderful stories, even basic stuff we use all the time. Tide Pods. If you advertise it as this is a more sustainable laundry detergent, you really wouldn't get people so excited. You advertise it that they work well in cold water, so you'll have a lower electricity bill. That actually is a very appealing message to many consumers. And so I think that how do you think about it, not from the standpoint of, well, I want to tell them how environmentally good this product is, but how do I put myself in the shoes of a customer and define a value proposition that will be meaningful for them, that they will be able to embrace, that will appeal to why they're ready to buy my product rather than someone else's, or maybe pay some small premium on top. I think so that would be the second dimension, is really shaping winning customer propositions. And then I'd say the third thing is we're sort of early in the process of shifting from carbon dioxide and related greenhouse gases to a broader nature solution. The COP for Nature that took place here in Montreal was a seminal event. A seminal event to try to broaden the landscape to say, yes, in many ways, it's hard to act, but in some ways, carbon dioxide and its related gases are the easiest to understand because that molecule of methane or carbon dioxide is the same whether it sits over Africa, Montreal, Paris, it doesn't matter. Whereas understanding water impacts will be very different here in Quebec than it would be in the southwestern United States, than it would be in South Asia. Or understanding biodiversity issues is much more challenging. Or plastic waste even is a different kind of problem in some parts of the more developed world than it is in other parts where it's leaking into the oceans. And so it's a more complicated challenge for most companies to embrace biodiversity, but I'm glad to see that the world is recognizing that we have planetary boundaries that extend beyond just working on greenhouse gases and taking on these other challenges. I'd say most of us are in the early stage of that journey right now.
Looking at the strategy that companies follow, there's both the opportunities you've been talking about to get in front of the new markets that are opening up, new potential. There's also the risk. Many companies have assets that have been causing environmental degradation over the course of decades. They have a choice. They can either remediate or they can divest.
Right.
What about this choice between divestiture and passing the problem on to somebody else as opposed to taking on the liability and fixing it yourself.
Yeah, I'm not a divestiture fan, and I mean that from both angles, because divestiture gets used in two contexts. One is companies divesting out of their worst assets to make their overall numbers seem better, and the other is investors divesting away from companies that have more challenged portfolios to ones that are truly green or at least neutral for their investments. And in both cases, I think it is more responsible to engage and act than to divest. That doesn't say that you never divest. I'm not saying that companies may say this has nothing to do with our portfolio. Someone is better able to fix this problem than we are. Investors could say, look, I've tried to work with this company. They clearly have no interest in this topic. I don't want to be a part of it. So I'm not saying there are no scenarios where divestment makes sense, but I personally come from a standpoint where I would so much rather see both companies take ownership of the difficult parts of their portfolio and figure out how to make them better. And that also requires the climate community then crediting those companies rather than lambasting those companies. I mean, part of what frustrates, I appreciate, pressure helps sometimes to act at speed, and I appreciate that there's an active climate community that's pushing the world to go further and faster. But I think sometimes when you take companies that have assets that have clearly been viewed as productive assets in society, but are challenged from an environmental point of view, and they're trying to take them on, to hold them, to paint them in a very negative light, if anything, makes people want to avoid the topic entirely. Like, I don't think that's always the most productive way. And I think from an investor point of view, I so much think we're better off to go in and vote our shares, express our views to management teams, ask whoever's holding our assets to do the same thing, rather than to just walk away without at least trying. And I understand someone says, well, I've tried and I've tried. So I understand at some point you say, we're not getting there. But I think in many cases, as we're now in this S-curve of recognition of importance and of actions, now's the time to double down on engagement rather than walk away. It's also hard, by the way, at least when I talk to CEOs, I get this double set of pressures. There's the pressure on the one side from the activist community that whatever I do, they're not going to think it's good enough. And so I'm better off to keep my head, act, but keep my head down. And if you're in the US, and I don't think this is so true in most of the rest of the world, but it's for sure true in the US, you now have a set of governors and politicians on the far right, on the other end of the spectrum, who are talking about ESG as if, it's a dirty word, are trying to pressure people to not even look at ESG in investment decisions, or punish individuals who talk too much about it or think or want to act too aggressively. So there's a phrase, I don't know how common it is up here, but green hushing, which was a phrase I never heard before this year. It's like one of the words of the year. Nothing competes with generative AI, but if you were to go down the list a little bit, you'd see green hushing. And I think that idea that 2 years ago, or even 3 years ago, so not long ago, you'd say words were ahead of actions. Companies were holding up their arms and saying, look at us, sometimes when they weren't actually doing nearly as much as they should. Now you actually have a number of companies that have made commitments. Maybe they're not quite as broad as they should be, as we discussed, but they're actually really acting, but they're very hesitant to say too much. They will be seen as insufficient on one side, and they'll have people really angry at them on the other, and it's better to be silent, act, but be relatively silent. And I think that we're seeing more of that now.
Time is short, but a couple other areas that I want to touch on. First of all is technology. Focusing specifically on climate change. I realize there's no silver bullet that you snap your fingers and the problem is gone. But to what extent are we going to be reliant upon technology as opposed to other changes in human behavior or other methodologies we might use to combat climate change?
So let me kind of map that from two different angles. I think the way you intended it, which I'll start with, is, when we do so much work across all industries, and we're constantly drawing these curves that said, at what cost, rank how expensive it'll be to remove carbon from the least expensive, actually sometimes profitable because you're putting in renewables and you're saving money, all the way to the very most expensive. And it comes out industry after industry that somewhere between 50 and 70% of the carbon that they have in their model, often including their scope 3, can be removed at relatively low cost. Not zero, but relatively low. But the last 20 to 40%, let's say, and maybe a little more in a few places, is really expensive to take out. I think that technology, the need for new technology is not an excuse not to act now, because we just see in industry after industry, people can go further than they think with less economic implications than they expect to take it on now. On the flip side, we need to fully decarbonize. We need net zero. And when you get to net zero, we don't have some of the technologies we need. We need more advanced reduction technologies, particularly hydrogen technologies, heavy industry technologies, and we'll need removal technologies at scale, from technologies related to agriculture, like regenerative agriculture, to technologies like carbon capture and direct air capture that will be essential. So we have a big agenda for technology, but it's not an excuse not to act now. It's the second half of the next 27 years it's going to be critical.
So,
and then just one last quick point. We also need to leverage digital and measurement technologies to a greater extent than we do. And I think that this knowing where your carbon is, not just in your operation, but in your supply chain, is way under leveraged. And those digital tools exist, but many companies have not yet really embraced them sufficiently.
So final question. What's the cost of all of this? What, in an article that you wrote about direct carbon capture, you drew an analogy to NASA's space research budget of $20 billion a year.
Right.
What's the order of magnitude of cost that we're looking at here? And what's the role that financial institutions can play in terms of facilitating the transition you've been talking about?
So those are two big questions. I would say, as I said, a lot of what we need to do will be done with reduction orientation, and that reduction can be done with today's technologies at reasonable cost. The last 20 to 40%, where we need to develop both better reducing technologies and removal technologies, that's going to be very expensive to do, and the world will have to invest, I would say cumulatively, not just in direct air capture, that was just a few $100 billion, but probably, the low trillions of dollars to do that, but over decades. I mean, in a $100 trillion a year global economy. So this isn't saying it's, we're not going to eat or we're not going to be able to continue to grow, but they will be expensive. And then the final thing, to your last point, I think that banks and asset managers and other financial institutions have an enormously important role to play to both be the facilitators of how to shift capital. I'm not saying, look, the world will need fossil fuels for decades. Like, this isn't about we don't need fossil fuels anymore, but we do need to have a shift where more and more things go towards removals, towards renewables, towards other technologies. But it's also an education role. I mean, some of the most impressive things I've seen some of the banks do is not just, change their loan portfolios. It's educate their bankers how to talk to small and medium-sized businesses. It's be a part of shaping the landscape of conversation. It's really taking on the responsibility, not just to deploy capital, but to help their customers understand how they should interpret this, how they can make it work financially, and how they can use it to build business advantage. Banks want to lend to great businesses, so the best thing a bank can do is help a customer know what it means to build a great business in a decarbonized world. And I see banks and asset managers as very important roles to play in that, and getting better, a lot of work to do on tracking the right measures, following the right things to be able to do that.
Rich, sadly, we're out of time for this fireside chat, but it's a conversation which is just getting started and which is going to become more intense over the course of literally decades to come. Thank you for setting the scene for us, and thank you for the leadership you're providing within the business community and the broader society as a whole in terms of addressing these issues and trying to find solutions.
Well, thank you. It's already become a passion for me. Thank you.